Welcome everyone to today's Edison Electric Institute webinar on SMRs and the future of nuclear energy. My name is Vanessa Ferrero and I'm a manager for international programs at EEI. Today's discussion features Robbie Sohi from Ontario Power Generation, who will discuss OPG's climate plan and their work in small modular nuclear reactors. Before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping items and remind everyone of EEI's compliance with antitrust laws. As you all know, EEI and its members are committed to full compliance with all laws and regulations and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we do business. This commitment includes strict compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. Throughout this session, we encourage you to join in the conversation by submitting questions using the chat feature. The webinar presentation and recording will be made available to all attendees after today's session. And now I will turn this over to Lawrence Jones, Vice President for International Programs at Edison Electric Institute, who will moderate today's session.
Good afternoon, or good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Vanessa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, we're delighted to have this webinar today, which is going to focus on a topic we know is critical for our industry, which is the issue of nuclear. As we talk today, we see what's happening around the globe with regards to the energy transition. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us today Robbie Sohi, who is going to talk to us about OPG's work on modular reactor. As you know, there's a big debate with regards to how the nuclear industry is going to evolve, specifically as it relates to not just small modular reactors, but even the large ones. And so I think the perspectives from OPG today will be very valuable. And Robbie, we look forward to your presentation. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. So over to you, Robbie.
Well, thank you so much, Lawrence and Vanessa. Well, good morning. Today, I'm going to spend a few minutes with you on the climate change action plan that OPG has and how the SMRs fit in. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on context setting and really, that'll sort of lead into how the SMRs actually fit into the climate change action plan. Let me just try and share my screen first. Okay, all right. Can you see my screen, Vanessa? Just want to
Yes.
just perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of OPG, we are Ontario's largest clean power generator. We're owned by by the province of Ontario. They're the only shareholder. $60 billion in assets, total assets, and we have quite a diverse fleet. I'll go over that in a bit. And then just over 9,000 employees. And as part of our nuclear fleet, we do run 2 large nuclear plants, Pickering and Darlington. We're the leading producer of nuclear isotopes as well. So in terms of just our sort of impact, we have a long, proud history in Ontario, and my virtual screen behind me today, the image I have is actually one of the plants. I just move over here that you can see the pipes coming down the hill. That plant was built in 1898. So we do have a very proud history of hydro plant operations, nuclear operation, and our gas fleet and the coal plants that were shut down. So in terms of what's the impact to our shareholder, right? So over the past 5 years, we've returned $4 billion in net income to the province of Ontario. And then we continue, the other piece is anything we do in our business, and this is going to be key for SMRs as well, is having that, we have a proud history of leading development partnership with our Indigenous communities that we operate in, right? Where the Indigenous communities, we have a partnership with them, and when we do have a very positive relationship where, when we go to build any of these assets that I just talked about, generally we're a partner of choice with them. So we have in some of the hydro plants, the latest plants that were built, we actually have an equity partnership. And on the SMR file, we're having the same type of discussion with our Indigenous partners. So in terms of our portfolio, about 19,000 megawatts of installed capacity, 66 hydro plants. We run over 24 river system, 2 nuclear plants, that's a Pickering and Darlington plants. And then we also have 2 leased nuclear plants to Bruce Power. And we have a biomass plant in northwestern Ontario. And we also have a dual fuel natural gas and oil plant, which is primarily a peaking plant. Then we have 4 gas stations, solar farm, and then we have our footprint. Some of you may be aware, we bought some assets in the US, and we continue to grow that portfolio as well. So this is kind of the geographically where we are, primarily in Ontario, and some plants in the US that we just recently acquired. So the climate change plan for OPG, we are, as far as the sort of the climate change front, our goal clearly is to be a leader, right? And so net zero company by 2040, and also, as we help the province and the Canadian economy, especially with the SMRs, is to be a catalyst for net zero carbon economy by 2050, and we see ourselves as that leader. What are some of the key initiatives? If you look at how do we actually accomplish some of the things that I just talked about on the climate change by 2040 and 2050. So we see clearly, to achieve those goals, SMRs are part of the solution, right? They're not the only solution. At OPG, we take a very balanced approach in terms of, how we see the electrical system and our role in decarbonizing transportation and decarbonizing the electrical generation, right? So when we look at our portfolio in particular, our climate change action plan, SMRs are part of the solution. So is hydro. It's the best renewable you can have. Then, solar is part of our storage, right? And hydrogen and electrification. Those are sort of the, areas we maybe perhaps have not done before as a power generator. But if, in terms of decarbonizing the transportation sector, we see a role for us in both electrification and hydrogen. So I think, if you look at some of the things we're doing on, it's really development of small modular reactors, the electrification piece. Some of you may be aware, we are in the middle of executing a refurbishment for our Darlington plant. That's a 900 megawatt turbines. Is that plant? We just done one unit. Second unit is underway right now, and then we also have our existing hydro fleet. We continue to reinvest heavily into our hydroelectric fleet, either a refurbishment or upgrading or redeveloping some of the sites that are end of their life, and then also focus on adaptation and resiliency of all our assets. And we continue to explore opportunities on the non-hydro side in renewables and energy storage, investing in negative emissions technologies. And also, when you operate 24 river systems, you got to have this approach around nature-based solutions and biodiversity initiatives, right? We've been doing this for hundreds of years, and we'll continue to be in that area. Now I'm going to touch a little bit on the electrification piece. So, I look at sort of both broadly, really. I look at decarbonizing the transportation sector, right? And that, for us, we look at 2 things when we talk about decarbonizing the, transportation sector. It's really electrification and hydrogen. So, in our view, the transportation provides the best opportunity. So if you look at some of the work we've done now, personal EV charging, we're electrifying some ferries and also some transit systems. We have a partnership with Hydro One. Hydro One is a major, is a transmitter. They own all the transmission assets in Ontario. We're partnering with them to essentially build the largest and most connected EV fast charging network. It's called the IV network, connecting sort of north to south, east to west, 160 chargers, 70 plus sites, and we continue to sort of expand in this area. I think the other piece we look at it is, you gotta, if you sort of look forward, you have more SMRs. Electrification has the potential to sort of lower the electricity rates by spreading the, we have a system cost that's fixed. Really what you're doing is you're leveraging that existing system plus adding new generation, so you can, keep the cost dollars per megawatt hour lower for every customer in Ontario. And then I look at the on the transit side, right? So there's a couple things that happen. When we work with the transit agency, we are essentially, we know the business of electrical systems, and what the transit agency is looking for is they want their bus charged, and they don't want to have to deal with the infrastructure as to how they make that charging system available. So, and we at OPG, when we start to do these things, really what you're doing is just purely, if you look at it from a procurement perspective, we have, our annual spend at OPG is around $2.8 billion. And when you start to combine some of the additional spend on the electrical infrastructure, our experience shows that when we consolidate demand and when we give vendors long-term visibility into what the demand may be, and they have visibility and predictability to the future, we have done enough vendor of record setups right now within OPG where essentially, the material cost is in the range of about 12 to 18%. So on average, about 15%. And in terms of executing the transaction in public procurement, 40% time savings in procurement. And that's simply just leveraging the existing infrastructure we have and existing vendors of record we have set up. So you consolidate demand, you go to the market quickly, or in some cases you have the contracts already set up, you're just leveraging existing contracts. The way the transit electrification works is we essentially take the electricity off wherever the system from a local utility, we put in the charging infrastructure, and we own and operate and maintain those assets on behalf of a transit agency. So maybe just now, the topic of the day is SMRs. All the stuff we talked about today is really, if you do hydrogen, if you do electrification, if you want to meet those climate change goals, SMRs are part of the solution. Right? Like I said earlier, they're not the only solution, but I think they're for sure. If you're going to get there, they're part of the solution. So we are, if you look at potential applications in Canada, you've got on-grid, this is 150 to 300 megawatt reactors. Then you've got heavy industry, 10 to 80 megawatts. And then you essentially have sort of a small 1 to 10 megawatt. So we are today, as I'm sort of talking to you, if you just today really status within OPG is we are actively working on a 300 megawatt plus reactor at Darlington New Nuclear, and then also through our joint venture with OPG and USNC, we are also working on a 5 megawatt, 15 megawatt thermal and 5 megawatt electrical reactor at our at the Chalk River site that CNL owns. So that project is underway. We've got the EA in execution phase right now. So those are the two areas in the SMR space. We see, on-grid 300 megawatt range reactors, and then off grid in the remote communities or some of the mining, mining sites, sort of the 5 megawatt range reactor. So that's why we're putting that commercial demonstrator 5 megawatt reactor at Chalk River. So this is just repeating what I just said. The micro modular reactor, the 5 megawatt reactor, like I said, it's a joint venture between Global First Power and UltraSafe Nuclear Corp. The plan today is we are going through the licensing process. The EA is ongoing, and we have the Indigenous communities in the area engaged with us. We know for sure this is something that if we're going to have success here, we have to have a very productive and a collaborative relationship with the Indigenous communities where these things are going to be eventually deployed. Right? And on the 300 megawatt reactor, some of you may be aware, we are working with 3 organizations right now: GE, Hitachi, Terrestrial Energy, and X Energy. This is for our Darlington new nuclear site. And then, the sort of the 5 megawatt GFP reactor, the in-service date for that is around the 2026 mark, and for the larger 300 megawatt reactors, it's 2028. That's our Darlington new nuclear. So using the existing site at the Darlington where we have our existing plant, there's enough large footprint to the east where this 300 megawatt reactor would go. So using the existing site license and EA at Darlington, we're proposing to build a reactor there. It's really, this technology that we're putting in service, it is, I'll take you back to the global sort of, climate change and how do we help Canada achieve some of those climate change goals, is really, we're putting the first reactor in service in Ontario, but really the technology chosen will not only meet OPG's needs, but also, Saskatchewan, Sask Power. They are, as you know, we have a memorandum of understanding between the premiers that this technology will be deployed across Canada, right? So, the manufacturing and construction of an SMR is expected to contribute around 1,900 jobs per year, and long-term operations probably around 300 jobs per year. And this all fits in well with the you've seen Canada's SMR action plan, and what, if you look at the just Ontario in particular, and then broadly in New Brunswick, and Canada's SMR initiatives seek to combine expert capabilities in many areas. We have nuclear expertise. We operate nuclear plants. So it's how do you sort of leverage that and grow that market. So in December 2020, some of you may have seen the Canadian government SMR action plan. It's really, a path forward that there's no question that there's going to be extensive public engagement and collaborative activities, right? So that if you look at the demonstration and deployment, so that's our Global First Power reactor and all the discussions that are going on the Darlington new nuclear, the cross collaboration between the provinces. So we are gonna, the demonstration is Chalk River 5 megawatt reactor will go on first, and then that'll become our commercial demonstrator, and then we look to deploy these reactors in the remote communities and mining sector, which currently they primarily run on diesel, right? The capacity building and stakeholder engagement. This is a piece that, OPG has done an excellent job when it comes to capacity building and stakeholder engagement in our northern communities with the Indigenous communities where we have successfully set up partnerships to build hydro plants. And the plan is to leverage the learnings and bring the same type of thinking as we develop the nuclear fleet, right? Because the SMR challenge for us, we see it as it's not a technical challenge. The two things that we have to be really good at if you want this thing to succeed. Number one is having that stakeholder, indigenous community relationship working to the level just like we have in our hydro fleet. So that's number one. Number two is the cost piece, right? If we can't do the first, there's no point worrying about the second one. You could have the best reactor, the most cost-effective reactor. If you haven't got that first piece right in terms of relationship, we know we're not going anywhere. So there's a lot of focus on that, obviously. Policy, legislative, and regulatory measures. We have in Canada, we are very fortunate with CNSE, the regulator. We have, I would say, world-class leading regulation and governance, right? It's now to think about in the SMR space, how do we also become leaders in that space as well? Technology is different, still have the same regulator. So it's looking at, policies and regulatory measures and to make the framework efficient so you can move with the SMR action plan, you can move faster, you can move efficiently. And so at the end of the day, the outcome is really having safe, reliable, and commercially viable reactor, right? That's sort of the, all these policies and regulatory framework has to be able to accomplish that. And then international partnerships and marketing to position Canada as a leader in global value chain. So if you look at right from, the fuel for the reactor at Chalk River that we're putting in 5 megawatt reactor, that fuel manufacturing will take place at Chalk River for now, and then sort of expanding that and becoming a global leader of perhaps a fuel supplier and as well as technology. Okay. So maybe I'll leave it there, and the value is in the dialogue and discussion today. And maybe we could start, Vanessa, I'll turn it over to you. And so if you can see and get some questions from the audience, and however you want to format the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robbie. I'm going to check. I think, Lawrence, are you still on the line?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thanks for that presentation. We're going to get into a couple of questions here. Let me just get myself situated. Give me a second.
I'll just take this moment to remind, we've been getting some questions in the chat, but just a reminder to all participants, you can submit any questions you have for Robbie in the chat, and Lawrence will be looking through those as he moderates the Q&A.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Lawrence.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. No, Robbie, one of the questions I want to start with is, can you just talk about public support? How have you been able to get public support for nuclear in Canada is one of those questions we're getting.
So, public support is, it's not an exact science. It is, part of it is experience, right? I'll share a story with you then to sort of put in context that, we have a lot of scar tissue as an organization, but we have learned to do it really, really well. So how do we do public support? First of all, early engagement, very early engagement. And I'll use Chalk River 5 megawatt reactor as an example, right? And so when we started talking about the project, right, we actually got all the community stakeholders engaged very early, and even communities that are not able, that don't have the capacity to even ask questions, we try and build their capacity, providing them support to build capacity in the community so they can have representation, right? So that's early for sure, very early discussions with the communities, and sort of the second step is you sort of have to look at where are these things going to be deployed. So when we look at that even requires you to start having education sessions, open public forums, and really taking the time to spread the word. I mean, today is a prime example, right? We're sort of communicating broadly to an audience, so you communicate broadly enough where you will get public support. And the other thing we do with our corporate relations is having town halls and providing both the technical information as well as information broadly about the project, and then also working closely with the government, provincial government and the federal government, to articulate why we're doing it, what's the benefit, how does it, from a government perspective, really what we try and articulate is, okay, well, how is this going to be good for economic development? How is this good from regional diversity perspective? In other words, if it's for one site, why would anybody ever be interested, right? It's broadly, how is this going to benefit Canada and perhaps globally, right? So regional diversity, and then the last piece is, how is this good for the climate change? So we do spend a lot of time in that space, educating every stakeholder.
So one of the other questions regarding public awareness, Robbie, has to do with waste disposal. Can you talk a little bit about your strategy at OPG in dealing with that? Because we know that's an issue that comes up a lot when it comes to nuclear. So what have been some of the strategies you've been using to build public awareness for the work you're doing in this space?
Yeah. So on the waste management, as you know, we are in Ontario at least, we're working with the federal government to have a sort of a Canadian strategy versus worrying about what each of these entities, or whether it's Global First Power or New Brunswick or Bruce Power or OPG, what are they doing individually? We are, nuclear waste management organization that has the mandate in Ontario to actually manage the waste. It's really, we're working with NRCan, that's the Natural Resources Canada, to try and develop a Canadian, broad Canadian approach. And the reason for that is, if you look at especially start to build reactors, SMRs, say in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then mining industry, all these areas, they have never run a nuclear fleet. So you can't actually have a sort of an approach where everybody looks after the nuclear waste themselves. That's just not going to be successful. So you have to have a coordinated approach, and hence the strategy that NRCan and Nuclear Waste Management Organization is actually developing as we speak. There is a forum set up to actually have a clear path to waste management, right? Because a lot of these smaller communities, what they're looking for, say a mine just, it's like the transit electrification. They want a 20-year power contract, and they don't want to have to deal with any licensing up front or building or the waste after the fact. So you got to be able to answer that question, and we'll have that answer very, very shortly after we spend some time with NRCan and Nuclear Waste Management Organization. But for us, from a what OPG is doing is really leveraging, Nuclear Waste Management Organization, who's going to lead, find a solution to the waste issue, and as far as the subsidiary, which is Global First Power, it's a joint venture between USNC and OPG. That's what OPG brings to the table for, Global First Power, is their nuclear experience in terms of operations, project management, and waste management.
Let's talk a little bit about costs, because there's one of the another factors that keep coming up in terms of the cost of this SMR. And specifically to start with, what would you say, given some indicative numbers about the and these are not things you're going to be held to the fire for, but can you talk a little bit about the sort of costs you may see in shifting to small modular reactors compared to the large ones with regards to cost to the consumer and electricity bill in general? How do you see that playing out?
Very good question. So, hard answer. So let's talk maybe on the 5 megawatt or less off-grid reactors first, because they're the easy ones to deal with. So because we know what is the solution today for those communities, right? They are primarily burning diesel, right? So if you look at that, and we have been very conservative in applying the implied CO2 cost. The implied CO2 cost in our financial evaluations is around $50 a ton Canadian. So with that, we are on par with diesel, and we've done lots of studies, and in fact we've taken the load profiles of typical mine. So for sure, in terms of replacing diesel with $50 per ton CO2 Canadian, $50 Canadian implied cost, we're going to be just on par with diesel, right? As you know, the implied cost of CO2, the numbers you're hearing now, is around $170 per ton as you sort of transition to removal of CO2. So, presumably going from 50 to 170, it's almost a 3 times advantage, right? So I think that there's a clear path there. It's just a question of how fast we can get there. And the other thing that we have not in these financial evaluations, you have to evaluate when you put a reactor at a mine, you got to sort of think not just nuclear generation. You have to think about all the other equipment they have, heavy equipment that runs on diesel. Could you, on peak, off peak, essentially leverage that reactor to put an electrolyzer with it that manages your load profile? So you make hydrogen and you store hydrogen and you use it so there's another. So we have not actually done that modeling in our financial evaluation. So that's the piece on the small modular reactor. When you go to grid size, large 300 megawatt plus range, you're into around, again, lots of work to be done, somewhere in the $110 to about $120 in that range, dollars per megawatt hour, Canadian.
You talked about, I want to come back to the issue of partnerships. You talk about SATS Power and some of the other entities in Canada that are looking at nuclear. Can you talk about how you went about developing the partnerships? And then maybe following up on that one, let's talk then about the supply chain, because I think that's where it's going to be very interesting. Should the SMR industry take off, supply chain becomes a very critical issue. So maybe start talking first about some of the partnerships and the strategies and putting together the partnerships, and then we can come back and talk a little bit about the the whole supply chain issue for SMRs. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll do that. Just before I do that, I see a question on do the costs include nuclear waste management? Yes, they do. In both cases, the numbers I gave you, the cost of decommissioning and waste management is actually in there. So now let's talk about partnerships and first of all, why, and then how do they work and how do we set them up, and how does it help Canada? So when I talked earlier about what is a Canadian government, and our shareholder, in fact, the province in Ontario, is looking for. So one of the things, when you develop new technologies, the regional diversity, the ability to deploy a technology across a diverse geography across Canada is almost a requirement. Like, we would never do this something like this if it's going to be one-off in Ontario, and then we don't know where the market is. So we have clear visibility on where the market is for both small modular reactors as well as 300 megawatt on-grid reactors, right? And once this decision was made that Ontario is going to do it, but it's going to be deployed somewhere else, we spend a lot of time with the federal government, provincial governments, hence this memorandum of understanding between the provinces. So Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Ontario actually have a memorandum of understanding signed, how we're going to collectively work together and develop this technology, and broader nuclear, how it's going to support Canada's nuclear action plan, right? And then, so that's sort of the piece on the on-grid reactors. And on the small modular reactors, the partnership is really between OPG today, as well as Ultra-Safe Nuclear Corp, who's going to supply the reactor, and the partnerships broadly. The discussions we're having is with the remote communities and mining sector. So we see them as a potential sites where we would deploy them, and a lot more work has to be done in that area. The modeling that's been done in terms of the initial demonstrator cost, and then how do we actually put that demonstrator and have the right partners. I'm going to touch on that as well. And then how is this going to be deployed and where? What's the potential? So if you look at the first demonstrator, the partnership between OPG, AECL, that's the Atomic Energy of Canada, and CNL, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories at Chalk River, that's sort of, so USNC, OPG, CNL, AECL have collaborated, and we continue to collaborate to get the first reactor in service by 2026. And then the next piece is the supply chain piece, right? So you reflect back on the can-do technology that operates in Canada today, right? And the skill set you have in Ontario, whether it's engineering, radiation protection, so operations and maintenance type skill. So we have that today, and we have a really good track record. We have some of those supply chains, but as some of you may be aware, our Pickering plant is going to be decommissioned at 2024, 2025 period, right? So, the whole idea is, as you grow in the SMR space, you leverage that skill set, you leverage that supply chain, and also grow that supply chain. So for example, if we end up supplying fuel for part of the market for SMRs, 5 megawatts or less, or 10 megawatts and less, or maybe even up to 300 megawatts, having that fuel supply chain manufacturing in Canada, that would be great. So those are the kind of things we're working on from a supply chain perspective.
So another question that ties in a little bit, and you mentioned skills. Obviously, the technical skills required for nuclear has, to some extent, in many parts of the world, diminished because of the growing sort of concerns, if you may. And so we have to rebuild the skill sets to manage these new technology. What can you say about the role of education in terms of developing that supply chain? And what kinds of processes has OPG put in place to build that supply chain, or to build the skills that will support the supply chain, to be more specific?
Right. This is the exact problem you're trying to avoid, because that's why hence the SMRs, we're doing everything we can to accelerate. You can just see, if you just look at history where this has happened, right? But in Ontario today, we operate a large fleet. Now, if you do nothing on the SMR or the nuclear file, Pickering plant shuts down in 2024, 2025. All of a sudden, our footprint shrinks. Naturally, you won't have the economies of scale. So the risk of not having or having less engineering and technical and even supply chain nuclear knowledge becomes very challenging. The way we're trying to position this thing is, if you grow the nuclear industry through an SMR action plan that Canada has put out, you essentially, take all that supply chain, the skill set, engineering, operations, maintenance skill set that's been developed and paid for by, public ratepayers of Ontario, you leverage that in the new space. But if you don't, then you will have the whole, what you just talked about, diminishing capability gradually, where it becomes a lot harder to now start, a nuclear industry again.
So one other question, Robbie, has to do with the issue of time frame. Can you talk a little bit about the time frame for SMR? 10, 15 years, when do we expect to see them going more commercial?
So, the commercial demonstrator at Chalk River, 15 megawatt thermal, 5 megawatt electrical, that reactor is going in service somewhere in the neighborhood of 2026. So that is, EA is going on right now. And as you know, we are probably, in terms of having a live project that's actually going through the EA, we're probably 2 to 3 years ahead of anybody else, right, in Canada. So that reactor, the plan is by 2026, that goes in service. The Darlington New Nuclear 300 megawatt reactor, on-grid reactor, that is targeted for 2028. So, the on-grid reactors are going to be deployed in, say, Saskatchewan or Alberta. That will not happen until Ontario has actually put in successfully demonstrated an on-grid reactor, right? So we're trying to time it so that by 2028 we commission, and in the early late 2020s or early 2030 you can deploy these things somewhere else in Canada, right? Saskatchewan, Alberta. And then on the SMR stuff, the MMR, the small modular 5 megawatts or less, we are getting obviously a lot of interest from the mining sector today and even the oil sands. We gotta be able to have a commercial demonstrator done by 2026 so we can actually with confidence say, yeah, we can be done. It can be done somewhere else. We know the time frame. We know the cost.
So I want to go international with this conversation a little bit. We have quite a number of people on the call from other countries who are basically, I guess, trying to understand how do we get an international momentum as it relates to a small modular reactor. What do you think we need to do? What are some of the ideas? Canada has embraced nuclear as part of its net zero strategy, but you still see other countries moving away from it or at least having concerns. So what can be done? What lessons can we learn from the Canadian approach to accelerate or at least to continue using nuclear as part of the energy transition going forward?
So I think, a couple of things. I go back to my earlier discussion. I think first of all, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. When it comes to electrical generation, power generation, I think, you'll never go wrong with taking a balanced approach, right? Because I believe, and that's what we've done with our climate change action plan, right? Is having, nuclear is part of the solution. It's not the only solution, right? So nuclear complemented by hydro, if you have it, complemented by storage, all these things have a space. So that's number one. Because I think the minute you start going down where, nuclear is the only answer, what happens is you spend a lot more time telling people why nuclear is the only answer. So, we just power system physics will tell you that you need peaking generation, you need baseload generation, you need some storage. All these things have a space if you want to meet the climate change goals by 2040, 2050. So that's number one. And I think the other piece is lessons learned from Canada and what we're doing and how to move this forward. Public consultation is key, right? And the other piece is, I think what's going to help Western countries is, outcomes and results matter, right? So once we have in 2026, if we have the first reactor in service in Canada, it actually, people can point to it, it's real, and that's the best way to show, hence it's called a commercial demonstrator, that it can be done. It can be done in a manner that engages, stakeholders. It can be done in a manner that's very safe, that's reliable, and that's commercially viable. So I think those three things, we have to figure out how to convince the general public, because their experience tells them something else, right? So the best way to do this is to actually have a commercial demonstrator and point to it so the Western world can see that this can be done. And I think that would go a long ways in promoting the SMRs.
There's another question that comes to mind, Ravi. You mentioned the international perspective and convincing the public. What about costs? And I know we've discussed costs already, but what are your thoughts on how we need to talk about the externality of issues related to climate change and the important role that nuclear plays? Again, not just the cost of nuclear, but the cost of decarbonizing the planet. How valuable is nuclear as a resource in doing that? And have we done a good job in educating the public about the importance of having nuclear as part of this equation? One sort of a side note here is the Japanese government, for example, the prime minister, I believe, has recently said that nuclear is going to be part of the equation. So everyone recognizes that we still need to have nuclear, but yet and still there are those who have all kinds of concerns. So what should be the approach from an international perspective to sort of garner the kind of understanding that I think would be necessary to meet the Paris goals, in that we cannot extract nuclear from the picture, and nuclear needs to be part of the equation. So how do we do that? How do we work the communication strategy to emphasize the important role that nuclear plays in looking at the cost of decarbonizing the planet and the role of nuclear in this equation?
Very good question. I would say, outcomes and results and action is the order of the day. That's how you're going to convince people, right? So if you look at, there's no question, and I think it's obvious that to meet some of these aggressive climate change action plans, nuclear is part of the solution, right? And I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. But I think the public perception around cost, it's a challenge for the nuclear industry, and we're going to have to overcome that collectively. And that can be, I talked earlier about CO2 implied cost of $50 per megawatt, per ton, or $170 a ton. And we just have to work with every jurisdiction to figure that out first. Like, what is somebody willing to pay? And then work backwards into what the number has to be. And I think maybe to some extent, as a nuclear industry, we're just not used to doing that, right? But that is going to have to be done no matter what. So you have to figure out what your, it's a total cost, what's the implied CO2 cost or credit in this case, and where do you end up with other sources of generation. I don't think, like, that's why, if you look at our SMRs, if we do, all-in cost plus the CO2 implied cost, if you're still above diesel, how do you go sell a nuclear reactor to a mining? They're not going to buy it, right? Why would they, right? So because they're looking for a technology that's safe, reliable, and commercially viable. So I think, if you don't get there, I don't see how we're going to put these in service. But we do have a clear path. We have the financial analysis done, right? We know this is going to be cost competitive. So every other jurisdiction in the world, unless you can demonstrate that it's commercially viable, I don't know how you sort of move forward, right? And the other piece is, if you, and we made the decision at OPG, we have a joint venture, like we run a 900 megawatt reactor, and here we are doing 5 megawatt reactor. You cannot have the same cost structure. You're going to have to transform. Because I'm the CEO president for Global First Power as well in my dual role, I tell my team all the time, here we're transforming the nuclear generation sector. And the transformation has to happen in a way that makes this technology viable, commercially viable. Because if we can't, then we're just working for the wrong cause. So it is very important. And that commercial viability happens through many ways, right? It's the nuclear operators, which is us, OPG, transforming themselves in how we view things, how we look at things, right? I'll give you one simple example. The Global First Power, the plant design is, there's a nuclear plant, then the other part of the plant, which is conventional, is called the adjacent plant, and we're going to operate like that. That plant will be operated no different than how a gas plant would be operated, right? You can't put a fence around the whole complex and call it a nuclear plant, because it isn't, right? So that's number one. So the operators have to have different thinking. Engineering has to have different thinking. Vendors have to have changed their thinking, right? And at the same time, also, we touched on, we have world-class regulatory system in Canada, right? Even the regulators have to think about the new technology. How do you make it as safe as it can be, and at the same time commercially viable? It's a very complex, I think people struggle with that, but unless we can get our minds around that, the path to success will be very limited if we don't.
So I want to get in 2 more questions before we end, Robbie. And this has been a very interesting conversation. And my apologies for not being able to be visible. I'm having some issues, but nonetheless, I'm verbally here. So I've enjoyed the conversation. But two closing questions. Prime Minister Trudeau visited Sub-Saharan Africa last year, I believe it was, or before the COVID, I think 2019, I think it was. And in Africa, there's this discussion about those who are saying that you should not use natural gas in Africa, and you shouldn't use some of the other sort of resources. You should only use solar, which obviously is not scalable. Do you see a pathway where Canada could actually, through its nuclear program, see nuclear being part of the equation for electrifying Sub-Saharan Africa, or even other parts of the developing world, using small modular reactor technology?
Yeah. No, really good question. I get this question all the time, because OPG's climate change action plan, we purposely, as you know, if some of you have read it, natural gas is in there, right? And we look at it completely differently, right? It's about a balanced approach. I keep saying that, right? Because, nothing wrong with gas if you're only going to run it, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of the time, because overall system cost to the ratepayers has to be balanced with, what's the CO2 emission implied cost, what's the overall cost. So if you just keep putting in a whole bunch of nuclear generation, what are you going to do when you have off-peak? So you have to think of the power system design, look at it from that point of view. So I think, that's why I use the example in a mine, right? You put a 5 megawatt reactor, well, they only have a need for 3, maybe 3.5, right? And then what do you do with the rest? So producing hydrogen, perhaps maybe it's a smaller reactor, right? With maybe some peaking generation, like a small diesel genset. Like I think you got to sort of look at it holistically versus in pieces to what's the best thing, balanced approach from a climate change perspective, from a cost perspective. So if somebody says tomorrow, we have this, virtual country that is thinking of putting in reactors. My first question would be, what's the generation mix to make sure we have a good, reliable, diverse generation, so we can actually maneuver, the generation fleet as the load changes, the load following capability of the system versus just the one reactor. So I think, if you look at South Africa, you mentioned, I mean, maybe the right thing is, yeah, for base load, let's put in a whole bunch of nuclear reactors. And by the way, we have a prediction of electrification and hydrogen production that is also going to be adding to the base load. So there's your size of your reactor. Plus, there's some peaks and valleys. You're going to do it with either renewables and a little bit of gas, and maybe combustion turbines. And the other piece that, like we're looking at it today is, yeah, we have a natural gas plant, but there's technologies there. We're thinking we are actually, for our gas fleet now, we are evaluating blending hydrogen, 20% hydrogen into the natural gas. So you just have to be creative to actually figure out what's the path to get to net zero.
So I think my last question comes back to what's happening in North America today. You talk about resilience and adaptation, and obviously we cannot avoid a question that has been popping up in everyone's mind as to what's happening in the southeastern part of the United States with regards to Texas, the cold snap that has captured the country. In that context, what do you see as some of the concerns you are having as it relates to the issue of resilience when it comes to having a supply mix that has small modular reactor and other kinds of nuclear technology involved? Do you see some of the lessons to learn, or are there lessons to learn from what's happening in Texas and other parts of the southeastern United States as it relates to building up resilience in your system? Because we're going to sadly, we're going to see more of these kinds of extreme weather events occurring. So talk about resilience and adaptation in the context of nuclear, so we can wrap things up.
I think, when I think of, adaptation and resilience, go back to, history, right? Diversification, if you're talking about keeping the lights on in your country or in your province or in your city, it's about diversity in the generation fleet, right? Because no matter what, each technology will have its pros and cons, and depending on how things pan out, you may have a risk with one or the other, right? So, natural gas, maybe tomorrow U.S. changes their mind on what they're going to do with, natural gas. Prices will go up. Maybe natural gas plants are not as economical to run, or some weather event happens where natural gas becomes expensive, right? So, what's the sort of the diversification in your power system in the fleet, so you can actually maneuver around some of these things, right? Whether it's a mine, whether it's a power grid. I think it goes back to a very simple fact that the diversification has served us well for many years, right? And you got to sort of keep that in mind when you do generation planning, power system planning. Those are the basics of keeping yourself reliable, resilient, and adapt to things. I spent a lot of time in power system planning, actually, in my early days in my career. That's the kind of things you look at, right? Is diversifying the portfolio so you can weather the storms, literally, right?
I said my last question, but I have one because you used the word several times: diversification. Extremely important. And so, what message do we then convey to policymakers and regulators and consumers, by the way, in terms of understanding the significance of diversification as we look at transition in the energy system? Because even what's happening now in Texas, we had the same thing in Japan. Whenever there's an extreme weather event, people start pointing fingers and trying to blame one resource. What I'm hearing you say is that at the end of the day, diversification has to be the end goal here. So pointing fingers, because today it could be one resource that you're going to blame, tomorrow it's going to be another resource you're going to blame, because you don't know how these extreme weathers are going to kick in. So how do we make diversification more central in planning, but also in policy making, so that we don't have a one size fits all as we design future energy systems? How do we deal with that? And what strategy have you used within Canada to make diversification so central to your strategy?
So I think, what I'll refer you back to is look at our climate change action plan. We actually we put a lot of thought, it's around, well, geez, we're putting out a climate change action plan, and yet natural gas plants are part of the mix. Well, yeah, they should be. It's having a diverse portfolio of assets, right? Now, doesn't mean we can't optimize gas. So I think it's taking that balanced approach, balancing economic issues, right? Customer ratepayer issues that the customer impact, right? With climate and with having reliability. It's almost essential to actually go through that exercise. And, for us, lessons learned, or what we have done in particular, that's the very first thing when I opened my presentation today, said OPG has taken a very balanced approach. We could have said, look, we believe SMRs and hydro are the only solution to get us there, right? It's not, right? So, it's having a balanced approach and sort of also having the dialogue with policymakers around the importance of having a diversified portfolio. And I think maybe we haven't done as good a job as we should. From a power system planning perspective, generation planning perspective, reliability of the power system, we need to do a better job of actually educating ourselves, the regulators, the policymakers, to actually get the message around the basic physics of different technologies, how they are, as collectively, they're resilient, right? And it's from a cost perspective, it's a very balanced approach. From a climate change perspective, it's a balanced approach, right? So I think we need to have more of these discussions. Exactly the question you're asking, Lawrence, I think, for sure, a broader discussion required at all levels. We have, for some reason, we have forgotten, or maybe we don't want to talk about it, is the value in diversification, because we get caught up in advocating what you're working on.
It's a good point to end, because one of the things I find fascinating is we're living in a world today, in corporate America, corporate Canada, I'm sure corporate every country, where diversity, equity, and inclusion is the key word, right? So we talk about diversity to make society work, but when it comes to the energy system, we want singular solutions. Well, I guess on this point, I'd like to thank you so much, Robbie, for your excellent presentation. We've got a lot of questions in, and I look forward to seeing you in person. Hopefully next time my situation will be much better, that we can have an eye-to-eye conversation. So thank you so much, and good luck to OPG and what you guys are doing. Let me turn it over to Vanessa for any closing words. Vanessa?
Thank you, Lawrence. And yes, thank you, Robbie, for sharing OPG's experience with SMRs with us. Thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. We hope you found the discussion valuable and insightful, and we appreciate your thoughtful questions throughout the session. We will send out the webinar presentation and a recording to all attendees, and we look forward to your attendance at our future webinars and virtual events. To continue engaging with EEI international programs and to learn about other upcoming events, please follow us on Twitter or visit our website. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.